those of you standing in the back, we do have some chairs sort of scattered around. If you're really wanting to sit by a couple, that may not be possible, but you can probably find a seat. There's a couple up here, some over here. You have a chair next to you. Oh, it looks like most people are seated at this point. Anyway, thank you all for coming out to our third Friday on 3rd Street. We're really happy this month to be partnering with the Florida Public Archeology Network. We have Amber here, who's their representative, and they have some information about some other stuff that they do on the back of the room there, so be sure to pick some of that stuff up before you leave. A few things I want to pitch before we get going here. The museum is hosting its annual membership party this Friday. Sunday. Today's Friday. This Sunday, I'm sorry. From 3 to 5, and if you're not a member already, it's not too late. You can get your membership information tonight and still attend. We're doing a white wine and black tea tasting, and there's going to be food and drink and friends, and it should be a good time. Our next educational program will be October 6th at noon. It's going to be a brown bag lunch entitled Why the French? Sort of centered around our docent tour. The first flag that we talk about being on the island is the French flag, which a lot of people have trouble understanding why the French flag is there. But Jan Davis is going to be giving that talk, who I know many of you are familiar with. She's going to be talking about the French presence on the island in northeast Florida. Without getting too much further, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight, who's over here having to move because of chairs and whatnot. Dr. Rebecca Saunders is someone who I think many of you have actually met and probably worked with at the Dorion Dig between 1985 and 1990, I believe, were the dates. She did her PhD work, is that?
I did, yeah, but there's none of that in here.
She is currently an associate professor at LSU of geography and anthropology. She is also the anthropology curator at the LSU Natural History Museum. And she's done quite a bit of work on this island and elsewhere and for archaeology. Please help me welcome Dr. Rebecca Saunders.
Thanks. Boy, there's a lot of people here. I'm going to try for just a minute or two without the microphone because that will reduce my ability to gesticulate wildly. But if you can't hear me, I will stop gesticulating and pick up the microphone. How is it in the back? Very good. Okay, because I'm used to yelling at students. Okay. The title for tonight's little exploration of Amelia Island is Indians, Europeans, and Amelia Island, Archaeology of the Battle for the New World. I did one on 4,000-year-old shell rings and scientific skirmishes last night. So we're doing skirmishes and battles, and it's really not all that exciting. I'm going to start with a little bit about the cast of characters that you might not hear as much about as perhaps you should. A little bit about the Spanish background for coming over to the New World, what the motivations were, and also a little bit about the people that they met. And then we'll talk about Amelia Island directly. Forward. We might have to do it like that. Is this thing on? In Spain, there was no Spain, of course, before 1492, before Isabella and Ferdinand tied the knot. Instead, for 700 years after the Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula, the Christians struggled to take it back. For 700 years, they fought small battles of just a small ragtag band of people, not a very organized thing, but they came down through the peninsula like this and ultimately made it down to Grenada in 1492. And then when Isabella and, is that working?
It should be now.
And in 1492, the last of the Moors were excavated. They were ejected from Grenada, along with, just for grins, the Jews, because everybody kicks them out of everywhere. Anyway, so that in effect, 1492, the same year that Columbus left with their patronage, was the same year that Spain came into existence as a national unity. So this 700 years of taking back the Iberian Peninsula has a tremendous effect on the way that the Spaniards looked at the New World and the way that they attempted to hold the territories that they gained. When you think about the amount of territories that the Spanish were trying to hold in 1500, it boggles the mind. The Philippines, what they understood of the geography of the eastern United States, what they understood of the geography of Latin America, all this stuff. And there were only 8 million people in Spain at the time. So like that's the population of Florida. Nevertheless, a lot of people were eager to leave Spain because of the rights of primogeniture. What that means is that means the first son gets the whole ball of wax. And you got any other sons, they've got nothing to do. No property, no funds, nothing. And so there's this huge cast of characters ready to profit from adventures in the New World. So I think I got ahead of myself, but so Francis Lopez de Gomara, who I read, in the original Spanish and all this stuff, says, the conquest of the Indies began when that of the Moors was over, for the Spanish have always fought against infidels. And guess who the Native Americans were? Infidels. You got it. So this is a little harsh, I think, but kind of what the Spanish historians say these days, that there's a heritage of religious bigotry that the Spanish brought over. There is that Inquisition, that kind of nasty little episode that they had there. Under the Muslims, the Iberian Peninsula was in fact quite a Renaissance community. There was a lot of art and literature and science and agriculture and all that stuff. And when they kicked the Muslims out, why, nobody was doing that stuff. These guys were just conquerors. And so they had just a kind of a warlike spirit and inordinate national pride and a contempt, sort of, for trades, for agriculture and all this stuff. So when they came to the New World, they did not come as farmers. They did not come as tradesmen. They came as conquerors, and the Native Americans were seen expressly by the Spanish, and not so much in any other colonizing European power. The Native Americans were going to be turned into the Spanish peasantry, and they were going to do all the work. So Isabel especially, Ferdinand probably less so, Isabel apparently was quite determined that conversion would go along with this. She was quite religious, but of course the goals of the adelantados and other adventurers that went along with it were quite different. Again, there's this vast pool of disaffected, landless young men, and we know what happens. We can have a bunch of those guys. We're seeing it all over again. But the folks that the Spanish met were not just simple savages either. Again, you'll see a lot of Lemoyne drawings that I'm sure you've all seen before, but what else have we got? Martin, I want to say Martin Ted Morris. These are not simple savages. They were chiefdoms, and what this means in this little schematic is that there's generally, at the level that the Temucans were at, you'd have a kind of a central chiefdom and then subsidiary chiefdoms and then villages that went out of that, and all the way up the line there was tribute payments and all this kind of stuff. There were a number of different linguistic and tribal groups that they met. The Wali, as you see, the Mocama, and here on Amelia Island and elsewhere, the Eastern Timucua. You're probably familiar with this, the Western Timucua, and then in Tallahassee, obviously, the Appalachee. Now, these guys had been having a rough time themselves. In the 1400s, there was a big drought that brought a lot of the major chiefdoms to their knees in the 1400s. A lot of big mound sites were abandoned in the 1400s. Before our radiocarbon dating was very tight, we used to think that that abandonment of these big mound centers like Moundville and even Shields and Grants might be due to Spanish contact, but in fact it's clear now that this happened before contact. Can you see around me?
Yes.
Okay. So the largest chiefdoms are down, but they're still, and they're also still probably having some problems. Even by the 1560s, these folks would have been feeling the effects of epidemics that could have radiated out of Spain. and probably definitely, there you go, probably definitely, get up to there, came from the 1526 Ione colony, which was full of sick people and was abandoned after 6 months. The first colonization attempt there from Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón out of Cuba. In any event, so we're looking at a group of people that have, in the last 150 years, have been sorely tested, and yet still have very strict hierarchies with very strict protocols of behavior. Chiefs and chieftainesses were had their retinues and certain regalia that was specific to them. All over the southeast, you see pictures of the elite being carried in these little palanquins. You see it in the lower Mississippi River Valley. They're not just copying one another. This is something that's happening all over the southeast. They are agriculturalists on the northeast Florida coast, but probably only lately. The kind of data that we're getting from human bone chemistry, which I'll describe in a little bit, indicates that there may have been no really significant maize horticulture until the 1400s. So again, only 150 years of that before Spanish contact. Our folks were more generally probably fisher, hunter, gatherers, or fisher, gatherer, hunters. Depends on where you look, as opposed to maize agriculturalists. And these guys were canny politicians. They did not think that the Spanish at this point were gods. They didn't have any respect for their so-called superior weaponry. They thought they were ugly. They thought they smelled bad. Their beards were disgusting. But they did have those fine ships, and they could probably be co-opted to help each of those specific chiefdoms in the long-running battles that they had with their neighbors. Ever since the 1400s, in that period of severe drought, we can see clearly in the archaeological record an intensification of warfare that you see in here. And so these are, of course, a little bit overwrought. What the different native groups wanted to do was co-opt the Spanish to be their allies in the fights against their traditional enemies. Now again, this is a little bit grandiose. There were no battles like this. Just like in the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, these are not pitched battles like the Civil War or anything. We're talking small skirmishes. People go in for territory. In the southeastern United States, it's less for territory than for mostly to embarrass your enemy, rather than these are not battles for territory. And in fact, that disgusted the Spanish, that once people would win, apparently, from their enemies, they would just go home. Well, why didn't they go take the territory? What's wrong with these guys? So there was some miscommunication there between goals between the Spanish and the Native Americans. And in fact, when the Spanish failed to act like other principal men, the natives actively began to resist Spanish colonization. So by 1567, 1568, the Timucua were engaged in the Timucuan version of warfare against Spanish colonization until about 1600. However, another Native American characteristic that even DeSoto recognized was that they would not work together. A house divided, etc., said one of DeSoto's men, that cannot stand. And they realized that all they had to do was pit these guys against one another. They would not cooperate, and so the Spanish prevailed. By the 1590s, however, despite all this, these skirmishes,